Welcome to the European Compass podcast, the podcast where we explore the heart of Europe through its food, its markets, and the stories behind every dish. I'm your host, Julia Doust, and if you've ever planned a trip around a meal, then you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Today we are talking about Porto. Porto in Portugal, Portugal's second largest city that I was visiting last week. And to be honest, Portuguese food isn't my favourite, or wasn't my favourite. I've been to Portugal quite a few times, mostly Lisbon and down towards the Algarve. And the first time I went to Portugal, I was quite surprised because I thought of Portugal, I'd been to Spain a lot, and so therefore Portuguese, I kind of thought, it's Mediterranean food, Of course, Portugal isn't on the Mediterranean, and the food is very definitely not Mediterranean. Portuguese food is much heavier, much fattier, and just generally denser than you'll find on the Mediterranean. That's what I found in Lisbon and further south, and I was never really very impressed by the food. Love the country, don't get me wrong, but the food wasn't the main reason to go to Portugal. And then I visited Porto. Now, if you look into the food of Porto, whether it be blogs or articles or whatever, you'll almost certainly come across something called a francesinha. A francesinha is a kind of grilled cheese sandwich. This is a grilled cheese sandwich on steroids. So this is a grilled cheese, and in the middle you have some sort of meat, generally steak, and maybe some sausage, and maybe some cured meats all together. Ends up being quite a fat sandwich. It then has melted cheese on top of it, often has an egg on top of that, and then the whole lot is drowning in a tomato and beer sauce. This isn't a light, delicate meal. This is heavy, and they are huge. Now, it doesn't appeal to me. I'm sorry. I look at that and it actually makes me feel just a little bit sick. So I didn't eat this when I was in Porto. I did look at them. I did see them. They were on most menus, most sort of traditionally kind of menus, particularly the tourist menus, but I didn't eat it. I did look into it though. I did look in to see, well, what is going on with this sandwich? Where has this sandwich come from? What's the idea behind this sandwich? And it turns out, so this sandwich comes from a chef called Daniel David da Silva, who was a Portuguese chef who worked in France and Belgium. And so he was working there, and when he came back to Portugal in the beginning of the 1950s, he wanted to bring a croque monsieur sandwich back to Portugal and make it more Portuguese. A croque monsieur sandwich, 2 slices of bread, bit of ham, bit of bechamel, some cheese. It's a snack rather than a full meal. And somehow this Daniel David da Silva turned this into this huge, great big thing with this massive amount of sauce and things. Now, this wasn't served in restaurants and general population, everybody eating it. It was mostly what young men, ate late at night after they'd had a few beers. After they'd all been together, gets to the end of the evening, everybody's hungry, that's what they eat. Now that brings to mind, to me, a kebab. In the UK, that's what young men would eat late at night. And that's essentially what this francesinha is. It's the Portuguese version of a kebab. It's big, it's heavy, it's fatty, it's going to soak up all that beer and it'll do its job. But since and that was pretty much where it was kept, in this young men thing, up until about the end of the 20th century. And then comes the tourist boom in Porto. And somehow this has become the Porto dish, the dish that shows what Portugal can do on a culinary basis. And I think that's such a shame because Porto's got so much to offer. So to push it all down into being this grilled cheese sandwich that's really just not that appealing is such a shame, as I found out. Porto, it's a port. And the traditional food of Porto obviously comes from the sea. It's on the Atlantic coast. And that's where all the traditional food comes from. And that's what I found, and that certainly was more appealing to me when I was in Porto. And that's what I found to be absolutely amazing. Now, one of the traditional foods you'll find in Porto is salt cod or bacalhau. Now, cod isn't actually native to Portugal. You don't find codfish off the coast of Portugal. It's a northern fish. You find it around the North Sea, around Norway, and then across over to Newfoundland and Canada. But you don't get it off the coast of Portugal. So how did codfish become the national dish? Now, back in around about the 14th century, there was a trade between Portugal and England. And England wanted salt, and Portugal had lots of salt. And so they traded salt for cod. But they needed to preserve this cod to keep it fresh. And in those days, without refrigerators and whatever, they salted it. And so this salt cod became what people ate. It was easy to preserve. You could preserve it for a long time. You could take it on voyages. And this was at a time when the explorers were going out across the Atlantic to find new territories. So it could be preserved. And then the Portuguese found their own source of cod off the coast of Newfoundland. So they call this place, they call it Terra de Bacalhau. Bacalhau itself means loyal friend, so not local friend, loyal friend. So the codfish became loyal friend because it could feed people, it could be preserved and then used on these long voyages. And the Portuguese found this huge amounts of cod off Newfoundland, and so it became what they ate and what they used. And that carried on and was pushed even more so during the time of the dictator Salazar. So Salazar pushed more and more fishing expeditions out, in brutal conditions sometimes, to bring back this cod. And he kept the price deliberately low. That meant that the populace had a protein source. And so people got used to the fact that that is what they ate because this was cheap, it was a good source of protein. And so it became known, and the joke is that there's 365 ways of using salt cod. And that was the case up until the dictator fell, until Salazar fell, and it kind of went a bit out of favour, but it still remained as being this memory as a traditional foodstuff and what people eat. Now, one of the problems with salt cod is salt. It's salty, okay? And in order to make salt cod edible, you have to soak it, and you have to soak it in water for 24, 48 hours, and you have to keep changing that water. Keep changing the water until you've got rid of the salt. So I've had salt cod before in France. We use it in France. I've had it bits with varying success. Sometimes I like it, sometimes it is a bit too salty. When we were in Porto, one of the first places we ate at, on the menu, they had bacalhau. They had salt cod on the menu. But my friend that I was with said, actually, I'm not a big fan, so we'll have something else. And this particular place had something they were describing as Japanese pancakes. It had fish in it, and it was a type of Japanese pancake. And he said, oh, okay, that's something a bit different, we'll try that. And when it came and we tasted it, it was so salty. It was clearly salt cod and actually bordering on an edible. We didn't eat it, we didn't finish it. And the waiter came over and asked us about what we'd eaten and everything. So we said, this is the problem, is it was just too salty. We couldn't eat it. And he said, oh, yes, it's my fault. I should have told you that it had bacalhau in it. Now, what we said is it should have been written on the menu. that it had bacalhau in it, because it really wasn't clear. But he was saying, oh, bacalhau is always salty. I thought, okay, well, maybe that's how they make it in Portugal. And then later on in the week, I was at another restaurant, part of the Wow Porto complex, which we'll maybe talk about later. There's a very good restaurant there called T&C. And we were eating there, and they had on it some bolinhos de bacalhau, which are like dumplings, like fried dumplings eaten as tapas or eaten as a starter. And I thought, okay, I'm going to give Porto another chance with its bacalhau. I'm going to try this. And let's see whether it's salty. Do you know what? It wasn't. It was really, really good. A little bit of salt, but nothing more than just a bit of flavouring, a bit of seasoning. The secret here is don't be afraid of the salt cod, but know that it does have to be treated correctly. Otherwise, it is not very nice, if we're honest. And maybe the Portuguese have got used to this, and maybe their taste buds are a little bit more used to the amount of salt, and therefore they don't wash it out quite as much as my taste buds would prefer. But certainly worth looking out and seeing if you can find some difference. Now, in France, we have something called acras, which is similar to these bolinhos de bacalhau. The difference is that the Portuguese version is mashed potato, so it's the salt cods mixed in with mashed potatoes and various other fillings, and then deep fried. Whereas the acras is the salt cod, but then in a batter. So it has like a crispy batter and deep fried. So that's the difference between the two. They both come from the same sort of theory of salting cod and preserving it for these long voyages and being a cheap food. So the other fish that you'll see a lot in Porto is sardines. Sardines have a season. Sardines are in season June to September. And actually there is a big festival at the end of June. There is a big festival where they celebrate the sardine, and they had dancing in the streets, and they all cook sardines and things. I've never been to this, and I really do want to go. It sounds amazing. It sounds so much fun. But when we were there, there were no fresh sardines, but what there were was canned sardines everywhere. Every grocery shop and market stall and things were pushing canned sardines. So just outside Porto is a place called Matosinhos, and this is a port where they bring in a lot of the sardines. It started back in the late 19th century by a Frenchman who realised that Portugal, and Porto particularly, was a really good place to get sardines, and he started canning them. And this ended up being a big industry for the area. At one point, it was thousands of people were employed canning sardines. And then that got pushed even more, First World War, Second World War, because canned sardines is a great source of protein. It's nutritional, it's high in calories, it's easy to preserve, it's easy to transport. So canned sardines became a really big thing for soldiers and throughout the wars. Carrying on up to about the 1980s, about 1982, 83, there was 152 canning factories still operational in the area. Across Portugal, 152, but most of them in this area. There's now 20. So something's happened and people just basically stopped eating canned fish. There was no more need to preserve food. There was no real need to transport it in the same way. Freezing technology had taken over, processed food has taken over, and people have stopped eating canned fish. But sardines are starting to become fashionable again. There's a lot of gourmet shops are selling them. There's been quite a few TikTok videos of people using sardines, cooking sardines. It's becoming quite a big thing. And you'll find stands in the markets and you'll find shops specialising in sardines. There's some lovely shops with beautiful frontage and beautiful things, and you're going in there selling canned sardines. So we were in the market and we were looking for something to eat, a little snack. And we went to this stand and they were selling like a cracker bread with a fillet of sardine on it from this can. And the friend that I was with said that she'd never eaten sardines out of a can, which actually surprised me because she's a little bit older than I am, and sardines in a can has been a fairly basic store cupboard thing in my life. So we had some. So we started off with one cracker sardine. They came in 3 different flavours. They got lemon, they got chilli, and they got olive oil. And we had the lemon, which was, so fillet of sardine on a cracker, and we'd had a glass of white wine. We'll talk about wine later. It was €3 for this. Absolutely lovely. Really nice. Tasted fresh. I mean, tastes like it's a fresh sardine, but it's not. It's out the can. So we ended up having another one, obviously, and chatting to the ladies on the stand. So this stand's been there for ages. 4 generations been on this market. And one of the canned sardines that they sell is from the Pinais factory. And this is the only factory in Portugal that is still doing the entire process of canning by hand. And they do tours. You can go and visit the factory and you can do a tour and see how the process goes, which is what I'd be on my list for next time I'm in Porto. I'm definitely going on the list. Going on the tour of a sardine factory. So we headed out of Porto, just along the estuary and onto the coastline towards Matosinhos. And we stopped at a lovely little bar. You'd never find, from the road, you'd think nothing of it. The building next door is abandoned. There's a flag in tatters. You can't really see that there's a restaurant. From the broadwalk, you can't really see there's a restaurant. But we hired some bikes. And when we'd hired bikes, the man at the bike hire shop had said, go to this bar. If you're heading that way, go to this bar. So it's okay. It's called the I Bar. And we went down and it's this little piece of paradise. It's this abandoned building actually protects the bar from the wind. So even though it's quite windy on the coast, once you're in the bar, you're actually on the beach. You really are. Your feet are right on in the sand. There's sort of rocks and rock pools and things. And they've got little terracing out towards the beach. The place is just paradise. Absolute paradise. Sun's shining. And so we think, well, what are we going to order? And they've got the usual kind of burgers and chips and things on the menu. And they had the dish of the day. Now, their dish of the day was described as clams al bulho pato, which didn't mean anything to me, but I'm a food podcaster travelling, so I need to try different things. So I ordered this. And it came in a dish with quite a lot of sauce in it. These are little clams and quite a lot of sauce with some rustic bread to dip in it. Now, these are essentially like an Italian vongole. But the important difference is that instead of parsley, they use coriander, or cilantro as Americans would call it, as the flavour. And that does affect the flavour, it does change it. It's obviously got white wine and garlic and everything else. And they're lovely, lovely little clams, very sweet, just generally a really nice thing to eat. So I looked into this and thought, what does this mean, this Bacalhau pato? I may well be pronouncing that wrong. And it turns out that Bacalhau pato was a poet, a Portuguese poet called Raimundo Antonio de Bacalhau pato. And he was a favourite of a certain Lisbon chef. And so the Lisbon chef decided to name a dish after him, this dish of clams. And apparently this poor guy, this poet, never even got to eat this dish. And he always wanted to be famous for his poetry. He wanted to be remembered for his poetry. And apparently no one actually reads his poetry, but everybody knows the name of this dish. So this poet is now known by the name of this dish, which it's not a bad thing. He's been remembered, which I think is good. So these clams are lovely. So really, really nice, really fresh, very flavourful. And this is what Porto's good at, not grilled cheese sandwiches. Let's get some seafood into this. So we went to another restaurant called Emotivo. Now, if you're ever in Porto, this has to be on your radar. It's a tiny, tiny little restaurant. It has 8 tables. It's an all-female crew, which is something I always push for. And it's almost like a little show because it's got a theme. You've got a time slots to when you go. And there's a theme based around a certain area in Portugal. And the chef explains what you're eating and goes through it all with you. It's very, very intimate. You watch them cooking. Everybody gets served at the same time and you get some fantastic food. Now, one of the things that we were served was something called a caldeirada, which is a fish soup stew, kind of in between the two, from the region of Aveiro, which is south of Porto. And it's a coastal region again. And this is a traditional soup stew that was made by fishermen. This is layers of potatoes, peppers as in bell peppers, and fish, generally skate. Sometimes they used eels in one particular area where they have lagoons where they had eels, so eels were traditional. But skate was more normal, and that's what we had. We had the skate, which was lovely. I don't think I've ever eaten skate before, but it was really nice, quite meaty, but without a strong fishy flavour. I'm not a big fish soup fan. Fish soup isn't my thing. The idea of eating a bouillabaisse isn't appealing to me. But because this was part of this set tasting menu, as part of this experience is probably a better word for it, then we had it, and it was lovely. It was really, really nice. The skate kind of soaks up the flavours. And there's all the normal sort of wine and garlic flavours coming through. There was some, again, coriander, cilantro flavours. And the one we had had quite a lot of paprika in it. It reminded me a bit of so if you listen to last week's episode, you'll know about the Hungarian goulash. And this actually did remind me a bit of it because it had quite a lot of paprika. It was a similar colour and did have some of those flavours coming through, but again on a fishy note. And this is what people in the area would have eaten and have eaten for centuries. And it's delicious. And it's great. It's not like... The difference between this and a bouillabaisse is that a bouillabaisse was invented for restaurants. It was invented with specific types of fish to make up this specific flavour combination that they wanted in a restaurant. Now, the caldeirada, I have to keep looking because I can never say it without looking at it. Caldeirada soup isn't like that. This is a soup that fishing communities ate. And this is an open soup, it's an open stew. And then later on, we were eating at the Orangery restaurant in the Yeatman. The Yeatman, excellent hotel. Have a look at my blog, you'll see some write-up about the Yeatman Hotel. And we were eating at the Orangery restaurant there, and they had something on there called a cataplana. Now, I didn't know what a cataplana was, so I had to look it up. It's very useful, by the way, if you want to know how AI can help you while you're travelling. It's great for translating menus and actually explaining. So rather than just giving you, like a Google Translate was this word means this, it actually gives you a whole feedback as to what you might find in the dish, why it would be good to eat it, why it wouldn't be good to eat it. It's great, fantastic. So we had this cataplana. Now, a cataplana is two things. So cataplana is the name of the dish that they cook it in. And it's like a clamshell in that it's got a top and a bottom, and it's shaped a bit like a clam, metal dish that clips closed, and the food, the fish and the vegetables are layered up inside this dish, and it's then clamped closed and cooked, and the fish and the vegetables steam inside their juices. And when it's served, so it's generally, you can't have it as a one-person dish. It's generally two-person or more because of the size of this clamshell. So we had it for two of us, and they brought it to the table. So they bring the cataplana to the table, and then it's clipped open at the table. So obviously the chef hasn't actually even seen what's inside this when it's clipped open. You've got all the steam coming off with all the flavours and everything and the aroma of this. And it's then plated up for you, so the vegetables and the fish. And this is, so the difference here between a cataplana and the previous soup, the calderada, is that, for one thing, cataplana originated from further south. So it comes more from the Algarve originally. And second, it has a lot more seafood in it. So whereas the calderada is more of a fish soup stew, this is more seafood. So it's got clams, it's got mussels, it's got various bits of seafood in it as well as the fish. And it's opened up and served up to you at the table. And it's delicious. Really, really refined flavours. So whereas the calderada has a distinct soup kind of flavour to it, the cataplana has a more refined, very fine, delicate flavour because it's been stewed. It's because it's been steamed, not stewed. And this is lovely. Now, I know this isn't Porto as such because this does come from the south, but it all ties into the food of the area, all ties into the fact that it comes from the sea, and these are local ingredients, and they're fished off the coast, and it's brought in, and it's so fresh and so delicious, and a million miles away from a grilled cheese sandwich. A couple of other things we had that surprised me and delighted me in Porto. One was their cornbread. So I don't normally, in France we have wheat bread. We don't really have cornbread because we grow a lot of wheat. Why would we have cornbread? And when I've been to Portugal before, and I've been down to Lisbon and the south, I didn't see it there either. And Porto, it's everywhere. Every bread basket. So generally, when we've eaten at restaurants, they've brought a bread basket. It's part of you pay for it, but it's a bread basket and some olive oil for dipping. Some of the olive oil has been amazing. Honestly, a bit of this bread dipped into some olive oil. Oh my God, I don't need to actually eat. I'll just devour this bread. And this bread called broia, I think it's pronounced broia, is maize. It's a maize flour made into this cornbread. And the reason being was that when the explorers went out to the New World and they brought back maize, they found that maize grew in this area, in this north of Portugal area, where wheat wouldn't really grow. And so people started growing maize and making bread out of the maize because then they could eat. And it did become known as a poor person's food. This is poor people's bread because the rich could afford the wheat and the poor couldn't. And going back to this dictator Salazar, he was trying to push for wheat. He was trying to push for kind of industrial white wheat bread as being the thing that people should be eating. And the people in the north of Portugal never really lost their taste for cornbread, because they could grow it, and therefore it wasn't controlled and they were not under control. And they've kept this tradition of cornbread, and it's lovely, really, really nice, different to normal bread, heading a little bit towards cake in the kind of texture. it's sweeter than bread. And then we had this other bread that was even more local called a broa de Avintes. Avintes is just next door to Villanova de Gaia. So if you don't know Portugal and the geography of Portugal, you have the Douro River, which is bringing down all the lovely port wine from further up the river, bringing it into Porto. On one side of the river, you have the city of Porto, and the other side of the river, you have Villanova de Gaia. Now, that's actually where the port wine warehouses are, is Villanova de Gaia, and this is where the Yeatman restaurant that we were eating at, the Yeatman Hotel, sorry, where we're eating at the restaurant, is located. So it's in Villanova de Gaia rather than being in Porto. The two, it's kind of like one city really divided by a bridge, in the same way as Hungary in Budapest. You've got one side of the river that's called Buda, the other side that's called Pest, and the two came together to make a city called Budapest. Porto and Villanova de Gaia is a bit like that, but they're not officially joined. So you've got Villanova de Gaia. And this place just next to it called Avintes, and they make a bread, a broia, called broia de Avintes, that is a mix of corn and rye. So you're taking this sort of sweetness of the cornbread and adding in a nuttiness of the rye flour. And then they add malt to it as well. So they add malt and you get this moist, dense, nutty bread that when dipped in olive oil is just out of this world, out of this world. And this, of course, has all originally come from the sea. This is because they had people that were going over to the New World and bringing back on the boats the new products like the maize. So everything ties back into the sea, and a lot of the food tied back into this culinary idea of not poverty, but not having very much and having to make do with what was available and what was there. And another thing that they had that ties in again to this are beans, green beans. You think, how on earth does green beans tie into all of this? So we were at this, so the T&C restaurant, the same restaurant we had the salt cod fritters. And the guy we were with, who works at the WOW in Porto, said, "Oh, you have to try these string beans." Okay, that's not, it's rare that people are enthusiastic about string beans. He was right, they're absolutely great. So people come to this restaurant just for these. And they're called pexinos de horta. Pexinos de horta. And he said he remembered his grandma making these. These are very much a traditional food. And they are a green bean that's then dipped in like a tempura batter, deep fried, and then served up in a kind of mug. And you end up with this sort of 20 centimetre long, how many inches is that? About 8-inch long sticks that look, when they come out of the fryer, because of the fryer basket, they've got like a texture on that makes them almost look like octopus tentacles, because they've got this sort of crisscross texture on one side where they've been on the fryer basket. And these are absolutely delicious, honestly. You dip them into garlic mayonnaise and they have this perfect mix of crunch, they've a little bit of salt, you've got a bit of green in there to kind of, with the flavour of the bean going through. And it's perfect as a starter. It really gets the taste buds going. I could see that this would be absolutely perfect as a tapas or a start to a meal. And this was, so we're talking about tempura batter. So thinking, okay, so is this fusion? They've taken Japanese batter and added it into beans? No, turns out it's the other way around. So Portuguese sailors took these battered green beans to Japan. So apparently this is in 1543 we're talking now, 1543. There was a Chinese ship that had 3 Portuguese sailors on it. And they were heading for Macau, which is was, I don't know if it still is, it's part of Portugal. I don't think it's still part of Portugal. At the time, Macau was a Portuguese territory, one of their colonies. And they were heading for this Chinese ship, 3 Portuguese sailors, heading for Macau, and they got lost. They got blown off course and ended up in Japan. And they taught the Japanese about these deep fried beans because they used them on the ships because they travel well and they preserve well, and so they had them on the ship. And they took this batter to Japan, and the Japanese went, well, this is quite good. And then they adapted it and changed it and made it their own. But the original batter came from Portuguese deep fried green beans. And even the name, so these were quite often eaten during fasting periods, so during Lent and things like that, Catholic fasting periods. And the name tempura, it is referring to fasting, refers to a fasting period. And so the Japanese took tempura and turned it into tempura. And hence the deep fried vegetables that we all love. I just think that's, as a story in terms of how food, the history of food is all interwoven and all interlinked, and that we all have all these different traditions and different things that we eat, but they're linked in ways that we don't even realise. And actually, I think these deep fried beans might be my favourite thing I ate in Porto, and that's not to demean in any way the other food I ate in Porto. The cataplana was an eye-opener, it was a revelation. The fish stew, the clams at the beach, lovely, and something I do want to start being a bit more inventive with clams and cooking with clams. It's not something I often cook with. But I think the memory that will stick to me because it was so surprising is deep fried beans. So next time you go to Porto, and you should go to Porto, by the way, Porto's great. I think if you're in Portugal, definitely don't just stick to Lisbon. And if you're choosing between Lisbon and Porto, I think from a food point of view, Porto has the edge. Porto has fresher ingredients, it has more choice, and just generally the people, the service were amazing. So when you go to Porto, and you should, I'm not saying don't try the francesinha. Eat it, but eat it in the way it was intended at the end of an evening when you've had a few and you need something just to soak it up. And unless you're a big bloke, share one between 2 of you because they're big. And then the rest of the time, explore the beautiful flavours of the sea that you have available. That's not to say we didn't eat meat. That's not to say that there's no decent meat. We had some lovely steak, 2 different places. We had steak in Motivo, we had steak, and we had steak at the 1828 Steakhouse, which is again part of the Wow complex. Some fantastic steak. But to me, the essence of Porto comes from the sea. It is a port, and that is where it gets its strength as far as food is concerned. Now, saying all that, we haven't talked about the wine, we haven't talked about the port. I'm going to have to do an extra separate episode because I can't fit all the wine and port and all that discussion in here. So we're going to leave it as food for today, and then we'll come back to port and wine next week, 2 weeks' time. So thanks for joining me on the European Compass podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a fellow food traveller, and don't forget to subscribe for more delicious adventures. Until next time, bon appetit and happy travels.